All right, so let's talk about coronaviruses and a whole bunch of things about COVID-19. Very relevant to obviously what's going on this past 18 months. Good place to start. Where are we now? This is from a couple of days ago, September 14th. Apparently, there have been about 225 million recorded cases and 4.6 million deaths worldwide. Probably more. This is just what's been recorded. Some areas of the world, particularly developing countries and certain parts of Africa and Asia, record keeping is not quite as good as in other places. North Korea has claimed they've had 0 cases, but I think there's a special case in terms of what is going on over there. In Canada, you can see here's a map that shows the daily cases and where we're at. Not too bad compared to some countries. 27,000 deaths. That's a lot. Typically, typical flu season will kill maybe 3,000 to 4,000 Canadians a year, mostly elderly. In this case here, you can look at that and see that that number is quite a bit more than that 3,000 to 4,000 deaths. So, not quite 10 times bigger, but getting there. And of course, this is not just a year. This is covering about 18 months of deaths. You can also see from this chart that it has been coming in waves. So you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, and we're somewhere in the 4th wave. And who knows where that's going to peak or whatever is going on there. Time will tell. Hindsight 2020, they say. So one thing just to say about pandemics and outbreaks is they are a normal thing. I've been studying microbiology for quite some time now, and here's just off the top of my head some of the outbreaks that I can remember hitting the news, and at least from my perspective. So back in the year 2000, West Nile virus hit Canada for the first time. It came over probably from the Middle East is what we think it came from, just looking at the strains that arrived. You can see we have Nipah, SARS. Everyone forgot about SARS. It was only here for basically 1 year in 2002 and 2003. And so now we're calling it SARS Classic, and it disappeared, never came back again. And we had H1N1. You may remember that was about 10 years ago. We've had Ebola outbreaks. And of course, now we are at the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus outbreak. And just ignore my slide there. I guess I forgot to change it from last year. I'll just scratch that out because it is pandemic. Definitely is pandemic. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So where do coronaviruses come from? Turns out they come from animals. Rodents, it seems to be a good reservoir in the wild for them. And up until the year 2000, there were only 4 known coronaviruses that infected humans. You can see they come from bats or rats. Usually there's some sort of intermediate host because we're not always associating with bats and rats. So we think cows and camels are involved in these. And so there's the name of the viruses. H is human, CoV is coronavirus, and then they have a code probably named by geneticists. So all these ones were low pathogenicity, which means they didn't make people very sick, basically caused cold-like symptoms. Most people seem to get these infections relatively regularly, like the common cold, and we rarely think about them and diagnose them or anything like that because people get better. The year 2002, we saw the first SARS. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, and now we're calling it SARS-CoV-1, and that was pretty serious disease. People died from that, and it came to Canada. There were quite a few people, something like 40-something people in Toronto died from it. It never did leave the Toronto hospital. It was highly pathogenic and it was scary. If you lived in Ontario at the time, you probably have memories of people being quite scared of it. About 10 years later, another coronavirus popped up called MERS. MERS stands for Middle East Respiratory Virus, and we think that goes through camels. And now here we are, another 10 years later, and another coronavirus pops up. And this one we're calling SARS-CoV-2 because it's related to the first SARS. So Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. And we think it came from bats as well. We've found kind of similar viruses in bats. And so that's where we think it originally came from. The intermediate, we're not entirely sure. Some people say a pangolin. And actually, I'll show you what a pangolin is. They're very, very cute animals. This is a pangolin. It's a creature, it's a mammal, it has scales, and they're found in Africa and Asia, and they're used in traditional Chinese medicine. So this is why they've come up with the virus in China, because of course the question is, these things are highly traded for their scales and highly valued for that reason. And of course, we have found a coronavirus in one of these that is similar, but maybe not similar enough to the one that's around in humans. So we're not sure if it's intermediate host, but very cute animals. So I thought I'd share that with you. Here's another picture of a pangolin, and there's the little baby. Very, very cute animals. They're a little bit like anteaters. You can see there's a tongue there, and they stick their tongue out and eat insects. I think they're like termites, if I remember correctly. And one more. They do curl up in a little ball to protect themselves. Absolutely adorable. So here's kind of a mini timeline of this pandemic. We think the first patient was found around December of 2019. That's why it's called COVID-19. We're actually getting a little bit more evidence to show that the virus had been around for a couple months before that. We're not entirely sure exactly. December 31st, Chinese officials kind of announced there's an unknown virus, or what they think, and the virus was actually only identified in January of last year. It's hard to believe that's not that long ago. Only a year and a half ago, the virus was identified. Probably most people were not paying attention at that point. Most people were paying attention when suddenly Italy went into a crazy lockdown. They had all sorts of people dying. Italy has a lot of elderly people, and the world was paying attention. And it wasn't much longer where other countries started to do things. So it was March 11th when the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, and the NBA canceled its season. So, something is going on when the NBA is canceling its season. That is pretty serious. And the rest is kind of history. We all have different memories on what was going on in terms of our own lives and our different situations in our different countries. So let's talk about the virus. So we call it SARS-CoV-2. That's the name of the virus. Full name is Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. So corona, by the way, means crown or something like that. And if you take a look, the virus itself has these little spike proteins on it, and the person who named it thought it looked a little bit like jewels on a crown or a tiara. So they called it coronavirus. So if you get to discover something, you get to name it. So there's the virus structure. You can see it's a single-strand RNA virus, and those little crown-like things are actually the famous spike protein. We're going to talk about that spike protein a little bit, and that is what is found on the surface of the virus, and that's what it uses to recognize human cells, in particular your respiratory and vasculatory system is where the spike protein is going to recognize. So here is the virus genome. It is not huge. This here shows you how many base pairs it has. So about 29,000 base pair genome. Has some enzymes and some proteins. And here is the spike protein, the one that everybody's talking about. That's the one that we're making vaccines against. So I just want to stop and talk about what a variant is. Okay, because this is something that we're talking a lot about this particular virus. And this word is popping up in the news all the time. So just some quick definitions for you. First of all, what is a mutation? Mutation is an error in copying the genome. Mutations happen all the time. You have mutations in your body. Viruses tend to mutate a little bit more than humans or other animals, just due to the mechanisms and the proofreading and all those kind of things. But viruses mutate, that's what they do. It's not something necessarily scary that you might see in a science fiction movie. They just mutate. They change all the time. Some are faster, like HIV mutates like crazy. Influenza mutates a little bit. And coronaviruses actually mutate even less than influenza viruses. The problem is we're having millions and millions of infections. So these mutations do eventually pop up and we get different strains or variants. So what is a strain? Strain is the same species, but it's kind of a subtype or a subspecies, and it might have distinct properties. So for example, maybe it makes people sicker, or it might not be recognized by your immune system or something like that. So the term variant really just means you have another subtype, and sometimes strain and variant are used interchangeably. But usually what we mean by variant is it means it's different, but not very different, just maybe a little bit different. So they're calling these new versions of the coronavirus variants and not strains, which is just scientists trying to say that there seems to be some small differences, but they're not big enough to call them a new strain. So that's just kind of some definitions about what we're talking about. So we are talking about different variants, and it turns out there are, I think there's actually thousands of these variants classified. So when they sequence the viruses, every time they find a difference in the genetic code, they have a variant. Some of them seem to be propagating and being a little bit more common. Initially, they were named them after the place of origin, so the United Kingdom variant, South Africa variant, and so on, or Indian variant. People in those countries don't like that. Nobody wants a virus named after them. And so they changed the naming, and they're calling them alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and so on, and just down the Greek alphabet. And so what's going on with these variants? Right now, it seems that the delta variant has taken over, meaning that a lion's share, a big percentage of the infections seem to be delta now. So what is going on? Well, there is debate in the scientific community about what exactly is going on, but we think that it has increased transmission and might be a little less effective with the vaccines. But it's really hard to tease out that data. You got to realize when we're looking at transmission rates, how do you measure that? We have how many countries doing all sorts of different things. Some countries are starting lockdowns, some countries are ending lockdowns. Some countries, people are really good at wearing masks, and some countries, people are not. Some cultures are more touchy-feely than other cultures. It's extremely hard to measure. You could do this in very strict laboratory environments. And there's some suggestions that show that these variants are more transmissible. How much is due to the virus versus human behavior is hard to tell. With Delta, we think what is going on is that more viruses are actually being produced. So if somebody had, let's say, the alpha variant, and you're making, let's say, 1,000 virus particles a second or something like that. With Delta, you're making maybe 3,000 virus particles a second. And of course, because you're shedding more virus, releasing more virus, it becomes more transmissible. There are a bunch of studies on it. We still haven't teased all the details, but we think it is more transmissible and a little less effective for the vaccines. Again, it's all statistics and people trying to tease out the data with the vaccines and things like that. So the vaccines are apparently 95% effective, and the Delta variant, but only maybe 86% effective against the Delta variant. That's still pretty good. If you got an 86% in my class, I give you a handshake. That's a pretty good grade. So that's what a variant is. How much should we be concerned? Massive vaccines are still kind of the main thing to do. I don't know if it matters much beyond that. We really don't have strains that are different. We have effective vaccines, and we have methods for dealing with this. The problem is this virus is super infectious, and we don't have enough people vaccinated. And so this is causing problems in our hospitals and whatnot, and which is probably why we have the recent restrictions. Let's take a little look at the SARS-CoV-2 life cycle. So you can see the first part of this life cycle is just like all the virus life cycles. You have a virus with a protein on its surface. In this case, it's the spike protein. It binds something called an ACE2 receptor on human cells. So these ACE2 receptors are found all over your body. Particularly, they're found in your respiratory tract. So the virus binds, and its genome, its RNA genome, gets inside those cells. So there is the genome. The genome is replicated by host polymerases, and it's transcribed, which means it finds we make a messenger RNA. That messenger RNA is found by a ribosome, and the ribosome makes viral proteins. So this is just the same way all viruses in some ways. There's different viral proteins, one of them being the spike proteins. Some of them go through the endoplasmic reticulum. Eventually, you get your viruses assemble, and the viruses get released. And this is the virus life cycle. Sometimes it kills the cell, sometimes it doesn't. I'm not sure how lytic this particular life cycle is compared to bacteriophage. So you're probably familiar with the symptoms of COVID-19. So the virus, SARS-CoV-2, causes this disease, coronavirus disease. 2019 is when it was first described. So we call it COVID-19. So don't get confused. We have the virus name and we have the disease name. So this is partly a respiratory virus, so you're going to see respiratory kind of symptoms, things like cough, shortness of breath, those kind of things. Most viruses will give you a fever. That's your immune system working and trying to do its job. And interestingly, COVID-19, in about a third of cases, people are losing their sense of taste and smell. So I actually had COVID-19 about a year ago, and that happened to me. I remember getting a cup of tea and it just tasted like hot water. It was a very, very weird sensation. So I just wanted to quickly compare COVID-19 with two other common respiratory infections. So influenza, which is the flu, and the common cold. So let's just take a look at this here. So first of all, the first thing to know is that these are caused by different viruses. So COVID-19 is caused by SARS-CoV-2. This is the virus giving us all this trouble this year. Influenza, or the flu, is caused by influenza viruses. So this is a different virus. It has different proteins, different genome, all those kind of things. The common cold is caused by a bunch of different viruses. One of the main things that cause the cold are these rhinoviruses, but it's also caused by those coronaviruses I told you before, the ones discovered before the year 2000. And some adenoviruses. So there are a lot of causes of the cold, mostly rhinoviruses. So different viruses. Another thing to know is that there are vaccines for SARS-CoV-2, and I have the date wrong here. This should say December 2020, not December 2019. That was when the vaccines came out. Flu has an annual flu shot. Colds, there's no vaccine. Colds. Let me change that here again one more time. 2020. So if you take a look at the profile, they all have similar symptoms, but not the same ones commonly. So COVID-19, right? That fever and cough are big ones. The loss of sense of smell is another big one. But people don't sneeze. They don't usually have a sore throat sometimes, etc. So those are kind of the big ones that they're looking for, along with the loss of smell as well. Influenza, fever is very common. Fatigue and headaches are very common. Aches and pains are very common. Sometimes you end up with other respiratory things like a cough or sneezing, but not very, very common at all. Colds, the big one of the cold is the sneezing and the runny nose and the sore throat. Aches and pains sometimes happen in there as well. So you can see a little bit of difference in terms of what's going on with the symptoms. So different diseases caused by different viruses. Oh, looks like I actually had highlighted some things there. So one thing I want to talk about for a minute, and I want to talk a little bit about disease and then a little bit about vaccines. So one thing to say about the disease is that there's kind of two main things that are happening when viruses cause disease. Number one, disease is caused by virus killing cells. So as I mentioned, this is a respiratory virus, so it's killing respiratory cells. So you end up with respiratory symptoms, meaning like a cough or sometimes chest pains, things like that. The other main way viruses cause disease is they get the immune system's attention. So the immune system, when it recognizes foreign invaders, one of the most common things it does is throws out a fever. Sometimes fatigue, sometimes chills, fatigue, those kind of things. So anytime you get a fever, often you're looking at some sort of infection, and it's the immune system causing the fever. And so that's what's going on there. Sometimes you have long-term kind of issues such as inflammation. That's still the immune system. So you can have other parts of the body that they get irritated and inflamed, and can lead to other issues as well. There's an infographic kind of showing the virus is getting into the alveoli and the lungs, causing some buildup of fluid, which can lead to cough and irritation and things like that. Don't get too bogged down in the details here. Just a nice little infographic. So let's talk a little bit about immunity and vaccines. How does immunity work? So natural immunity, usually what happens is you have some sort of infection, and that infection is recognized by the immune system. So you can see there's a bunch of cells here. There's T cells and B cells, and all the details don't really matter. But these are immune cells that recognize an invader. They realize it's not human. We should do something about this. So general response is they can make these things called antibodies, which will bind the invader. Sometimes they go cytotoxic, which means they can kill the invader directly. And so they're mounting an immune response to kill that invader. And some of these immune cells are long-lived, and so they give the immune system a memory. And this is how we get immunity. So if you've ever had chickenpox, you're probably not going to get it again. If you've had a vaccine, you're probably not going to get that particular disease, or at least depending on how long the immunity lasts. Sometimes immunity can be short. So what about vaccines? Vaccines are humans' ways of trying to give an immune response, but not infect the person with the actual virus, right? So we're trying to, have our cake and eat it. We're trying to give the immune system something to recognize and hopefully not cause any disease. There's a whole bunch of ways we can do this. I think I have slides for each of these. Let me just take a peek here. The basic idea is training your immune system so that when you do encounter the virus, you're not going to get sick or as sick. So the classical way to make a vaccine for a virus is to actually use the virus. So there's kind of two methods here. We can use an attenuated virus, that means weakened. And there's lots of ways to do this. I'm not going to get into the details. Or you can use an inactivated or killed virus. And again, lots of different ways to do that. So the whole idea is you have the virus, but it's not going to be so harmful. A person isn't going to get disease. You might end up with some symptoms. Very common with vaccines, you end up with fever. And that's the immune system working. It's the immune system basically saying, hey, there's something here, I'm going to deal with it. And the fever is part of that response. Another method that's used in some modern vaccines is we just use a subunit of that particular virus. And so, for example, we might just use the spike protein. So we'll take that, and that will be part of the vaccine and inject it in the person. So this way, the immune cells will recognize that outer molecule found in the virus and make an immune response. So this is used in hepatitis B virus, or hepatitis B vaccine, for example. Now we are talking about some new types of vaccines, which are really, I think they're very, very cool. There's DNA and RNA vaccines. The DNA vaccines, we haven't had a lot of luck with. These RNA vaccines are the new thing that we're talking about, that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, sometimes we're calling them messenger RNA vaccines. So you can see what's going on here is we have the RNA, and the RNA is encased in some sort of lipid coat, and then that's what's injected into the human. So what happens is that goes into the tissues, and it allows the RNA to enter the cells. So you can see here's my RNA, it's entered the cells, and this RNA, in the case of the COVID vaccines, codes for the spike protein. So the RNA is read by host ribosomes. The host ribosomes make viral proteins, and these viral proteins go and are recognized by immune cells. So what's the big deal about these messenger RNA vaccines? But we don't even have to grow up viruses to do this. We don't have to culture viruses. You don't need to worry about safety in labs. You just need the genetic sequence, and the RNA is easy to make. So they're very quick to manufacture, which is why these ones won the vaccine race in a sense. Very, very easy to manufacture. So really cool technology, and I think we're going to see a lot of things with these messenger RNA vaccines. One of the other new technologies is kind of similar. We're calling these viral vector vaccines. So similar in that you're injecting genetic material. So in this case, you can see the genetic material is actually DNA. And rather than coating our RNA with a lipid, you're actually sticking it into another virus. So I know you're thinking, whoa, wait on here. But the other virus is usually a weakened virus or something that can't really infect humans very well. So the AstraZeneca virus, for example, that's used in this viral vector vaccines actually comes from a chimpanzee. And so the virus can't cause human illness. So they stick the gene in there, and the virus works as a gene delivery mechanism. So the AstraZeneca vaccine is basically a DNA vaccine. It makes those spike proteins. The spike proteins are recognized by the immune system. So also pretty interesting technology. So what are we doing with SARS coronavirus 2, COVID-19? Pretty much all of those techniques have been used in various countries around the world. There's a bunch of these vaccine tracker websites out there. You can see there's a whole bunch of viruses or vaccines in different stages of development. Apparently, there are 22 different vaccines approved in different countries worldwide. And so this is really, I mean, it's just really an incredible story of science about how much we've done in such a short amount of time. Now, don't think that, it took us 18 months to make these vaccines. Really, it took us 20 years. These technologies, people have been developing them for decades. And the virus just came out at a time when we had these technologies ready to go. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of answer some questions that I get a lot of questions around microbiology and a lot of questions around vaccines this year, more than I've ever had in my life. So what's going on with these vaccines? Did they skip steps? Did they, make them super fast? And the only reason why we can do this is, like I said, we've taken 20 years to develop these technologies. And the other thing is that we've dumped tons of money into this. So usually what we do, we go through different phases of trials. And so animal testing, and then you have a small scale phase 1 trials, which is like maybe 10 people. And then you have phase 2, which is, a few hundred, and phase 3 is thousands of people kind of thing. Usually what happens in between all of these steps is, the company will take 6 months to a year just looking at the data and planning the next step, because a lot of drugs and vaccines and things like that actually don't do very well. So they don't want to invest a bunch of money in getting the next stage ready until they know for sure 100%. And the approval process to go through each phase usually takes sometimes a year or two, just because of the bureaucracy of the government. With the pandemic, we've kind of done the opposite. The government said, no, we're going to work on the weekends if we have to look at these trial data to approve the next step. And in many cases, they've been spending the money to actually prep the next step before it was even approved, so that when it does get approved, they can literally start on the next day. So this is why we've been able to do things faster. The process is actually very rigid. Canada has one of the strictest countries in the world in terms of what they allow for drug and vaccine testing. Another question people ask, well, you're injecting DNA or RNA into me. Am I going to have new DNA, and am I going to become a chimpanzee or something like that? The answer is no. RNA in particular is a very fragile, short-lived molecule. It can't mutate you or anything like that. There's no mechanism for doing that. That's just people are not understanding the technologies and don't have a good understanding of the biology there. So that's a no on that. So when we say the vaccine is 95% effective, what are we talking about? It's just statistics. So for example, in the Pfizer, we'll pick on Pfizer. They tested about 43,000 people. And the way they do it is they have 2 groups. So about 21,500 in a vaccine group, 21,500 in the placebo group, meaning they're not getting the vaccine. They're just getting an injection of saline water. And so then they look at the two groups and they wait. And so what they saw is that in the, after I think it was 2 to 3 months, they saw 170 cases of COVID-19. 162 of the cases were in the control group and 8 cases were in the vaccine. So if you crunch those numbers, 8 cases over 170 is 5%, or 162 cases is 95%. 95% effect. That's where the numbers come from. Different trials have shown, 94%, 96%. And the good news is the vaccines seem to be very highly effective against severe disease and hospitalization. That's kind of the good news, which is really the end game, is we don't want to see people hospitalized. People are going to get sick, and this virus is out there. Everyone's probably going to get it eventually. The good news is the vaccines will protect you from getting sick, or at least hopefully severe disease in most cases. So what about natural immunity? So I mentioned I had COVID-19, and you will get some immunity. They're still recommending you get the vaccine because actually there's been a couple of studies that show that for some reason the vaccine is actually giving stronger immunity than the natural disease. I don't really understand the mechanism behind that, but that is true with some vaccines. They do give you better immunity than the actual disease. How long will immunity last? We've only had the vaccines for not even a year. Really, most of us have had access to these vaccines for 6 to 8 months. And they seem to be working. I know there's lots in the news about immunity waning, and they're talking about boosters. And anyone who thinks they know anything doesn't. They don't have a time machine. They don't know the future. At the moment, we know they seem to be lasting 8 months. Boosters might be recommended for immunocompromised people. We don't know until we have more data, and that's going to take us a couple of years to really know how long the immunity actually will last and have good data on it. What about side effects? That is a very good question. I actually have a slide on side effects here. Most of these vaccines have typical side effects of vaccines and infection. So as I mentioned before, things like fevers, headaches, those things are very common with any kind of infection. And it's the immune system basically working. So if you get a fever or a mild fever or headache from a vaccine, it's actually a good thing, showing that your immune system is healthy. The good news is that these side effects, if you get a fever, it's usually a lot more mild than you'd have with an actual disease, an actual infection. So most of these things, you sleep them off and take a headache. There are other side effects that we are concerned about. Some people have had extreme allergic reactions. That's why when you get a shot, they don't let you go right away. They want you to sit there for a few minutes and make sure you're not having extreme allergic reaction. Other immunological conditions, check with your doctor. There are lots of conditions out there. There are other serious side effects that people have been talking about, things like this heart inflammation, Bell's palsy, and things like that. These things are extremely rare and very poorly understood, unfortunately. The reality is that these things are often induced by viral infections. So the myocarditis, for example, the heart inflammation, which is very rare, it's actually more common in actual viral infections. So if you get the myocarditis, chances are you would actually get a worse case of it if you had the actual virus. It's worth looking into if you're concerned about these things. They're extremely rare. We're talking about 1 in half a million to 1 in a million kind of odds. To give you some context, you've got about a 1 in 100 chance of dying from being in a car in your lifetime, a 1 in 15,000 chance of being struck by lightning. We still drive in cars. We still go out in rainstorms regularly, and we don't usually think about those risks. If you have any more questions, please ask me. I've read tons on this, and I know lots about some of these studies. So a couple more thoughts about vaccines. As you can probably guess, I'm a very strong supporter of vaccines. I think historically they have done amazing things. Talk to your grandparents. ask them about these diseases that we don't see anymore. Polio, smallpox, typhoid fever, measles, rubella. We rarely see these diseases. Most of us will never see them in our lifetime. All serious diseases that could have killed us in the past that we don't see thanks to vaccines. I'm very concerned about vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaxxing as a cultural phenomenon. And it's something that has caused us a lot of problems in the last 20 years. Measles used to be eradicated from Canada 20 years ago. And now we see outbreaks every once in a while in schools, and it can be very serious. Kids can die from it, get hospitalized, and it causes a lot of problems. And I do think vaccines are remarkable, and that we've been able to develop vaccines for this virus is it's very good news. And these vaccines are remarkably safe. I believe that the process is, I trust the process. I think it's good. I think Canada has a really good system for approving these things. So I hope you'll get the vaccine. I hope you'll encourage others to do so. And I welcome all the questions that you have. Just wanted to show you one more thing about vaccines. Here's some of the diseases that I talked about. And you can see some of the numbers, right? In terms of, the morbidity. That's how many people died from these diseases in the States before the vaccine became available. And some of these diseases basically dropped to zero or very few. A few newer vaccines. Some of these actually are so new, I didn't even get these when I was a child. And you can see the effectiveness and how much disease has decreased from these kind of things. Really quite incredible. So that's it for topic number 20. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I think viruses are very interesting. Please do ask me some questions and take a look at the study questions too. We are going to have this topic on the midterm. Anyway, the classes from here will be in Zoom, I believe, and I will record them and make sure I have the recordings available for anybody who misses or a concept or misses a lecture.